If he makes the wrong decision, the plane will crash. For everyone on this flight, only the pilot's skill can save them from catastrophe.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
Contact ground 121.65 is gross.
Around the world, hundreds of thousands of flights take off and land every day. Annually, over 1 billion passengers put their lives in the hands of the men and women who fly them.
Taxi into the
Emergencies are rare, but they do happen. The majority of these incidents are dealt with swiftly and safely. But sooner or later, even the best pilots will face the unexpected.
If it can happen in the air or to an airplane, it's going to happen. And this time it did happen.
We had never trained with lost vol engines, nor was there a procedure for us to follow. In fact, we were just improvising as we went along.
I saw a spot that for a minute I thought was a bug on my windshield, and shortly after that it sprouted wings and I realized it was an airplane.
I felt a hand tap me on the shoulder, and it was Sergeant Brian Bowerly of the Sioux City Air National Guard. And I'll never forget his words. He says, "You're okay, buddy, I got you, I've got you." And even now it's an emotional, sorry.
But not every emergency is covered in the rule book. And this is when the skill of the pilot is put to the real test. Larry Fuda, a veteran pilot with 30 years flying experience, came close to disaster in 1989 when a freak combination of events crippled his aircraft.
It was a pretty day, weather was good. We had a very routine flight out of Washington right on into Charlotte. Everything went as it was supposed to go until we made our approach into the Charlotte airport.
Captain Fuda was about to be faced with an emergency he had never before experienced. His landing gear would not come down.
I asked the co-pilot to put the landing gear down, and at that time we had 2 red lights on the main gear. Our nose gear was down, but our main gear showed that neither gear was down. Instant response to something of that magnitude was that maybe we had an electrical problem. There's no way that both gears could fail at the same time.
At a loss to explain the malfunction, Captain Fuda radioed his base for advice.
I had no idea what was causing it. In fact, the company people, the Boeing people, our maintenance people, nobody could understand why neither main gear was coming down.
Soon, the passengers began to realize that there was something wrong.
Because I had flown before and knew that it was only like an hour, hour and a half to Charlotte, then I knew, wait a minute, something's up because we have not gotten, we're not descending.
Fuda couldn't tell if he had an electrical fault with his warning light or if his landing gear was jammed. He decided to fly over the airport control tower.
Being this close into the runway at this time, we had to make a decision fast. So I made a low pass across the control tower at Charlotte. And at that time, they confirmed that neither main gear was down and locked. So that kindly threw out the electrical problem.
He would have to try and use G-force to pull the landing gear down.
Climbed the aircraft to 10,000 feet, and we dove it over at a pretty steep angle, right down to 5,000 feet. We have a speed clacker that goes off, and I can recall that speed clacker going off, so I know I was doing 350 knots at that time. And at 5,000 feet, we pulled it out with a G-force. And the right gear came out at that time. So we explained to the passengers that we had one of the gear out, and it was a very uncomfortable ride. However, we were going to try it again.
If you've ever been on a roller coaster, that's exactly what it's like. You go straight up and then you go straight down. And your ears block and all of that, and it's a real fast coming down. I can remember that.
I've never been in the back of an aircraft when it went into a dive like that. As far as an average passenger, I'm sure it frightened them to death.
The second dive failed to free the left side landing gear. Larry Fuda's next strategy was even more daring. He was going to bounce the 737 on the right gear to try and knock the left gear down. He would have to hit the runway at over 170 miles per hour.
If the airspeed gets low, it could be very dangerous. That's the reason why you come in way above landing speed in order to keep the left wing up.
His first attempt failed. Then he turned the aircraft around and tried again. Captain Fuda tried 3 times to bounce the gear out, but it remained jammed. He had only one option left.
We were getting at the point now to where we were down fuel load-wise, and we was going to have to make a decision fast. Went out and advised the passengers and the flight attendants that we was going to have to land, and for the flight attendants to put the passengers into a crash landing mode.
I didn't know, or I didn't want to think about the end or how bad it was going to be.
As he made the final approach, the captain's main priority was to keep the plane on the runway.
There was quite a bit of buildings on the side of the runway, our maintenance buildings, and I really didn't want to go into a spin and end up in one of those buildings with 100 passengers on board.
To keep the plane straight, he decided he would have to blow the tires, but this meant going against his training and switching off the anti-skid device.
We thought if we turned the anti-skid off as soon as we touched down, that maybe I could lock the brakes on the side where the gear was down and blow those tires, and that would put enough drag into that side to equalize out the side that did not have the landing gear on it.
His theory worked, and the aircraft held the center line, stopping halfway down the runway.
It wasn't over with once the aircraft was on the ground and everything's safe. You know, we had a little fire, we had emergency equipment spraying foam all over the aircraft, and I had 100 passengers in the back that we had to get off.
The passengers escaped unharmed. The only injury sustained was to Captain Fuda. As he jumped from the cockpit window to help his passengers, he broke a finger.
I was very thankful that no one got hurt. And the only reason why I got hurt was going out the window. You know, I don't care if I broke a leg or a neck or whatever, as long as my passengers got off. That's the main concern of anybody in charge of an aircraft, is to get your aircraft and your passengers on the ground safe.
It's amazing that we got out. And the only reason I think we did was because of the pilot being so senior in flying. And I don't know if he's been through things like that before, but he knew what to do. It's amazing that we're still here.
The problem started when the ground crew placed the chocks inside the wheel wells of the undercarriage, forgetting to remove them when the plane was cleared to leave. The plane's initial flight path made things worse.
It all started really on our takeoff procedure out of Washington National Airport. And the procedure out of there is you make an immediate left turn because of a restricted area. Then you make an immediate right turn. But when we took off with that immediate left turn, one of the chocks slid in place on the left gear, and when I made the right turn out, it slid in place on the right gear. Well, I've had several people tell me that you could win the lottery before this would happen.
The worst emergency for any flight crew is loss of all engines. This is highly unlikely, but total engine loss would leave a plane with virtually no means of control. This pilot was faced with just such an emergency in 1983. But thanks to his love of flying light aircraft, he saved the lives of 85 people. Captain Bob Pearson, one of Air Canada's finest pilots, returns to a remote airstrip in Manitoba, 20 years after pulling off one of the greatest feats of piloting.
This is the first time back, and certainly my first time flying again in Gimli. A little more relaxed atmosphere than the first time I arrived here.
The last aircraft Captain Pearson landed on this airstrip in 1983 was an Air Canada Boeing 767 with 85 people on board. The 767 was the first wide-bodied plane to have only 2 engines. The computerized flight deck, with its electronic screens instead of dials, was also revolutionary. Bob Pearson was in charge of one of the first 767s in Air Canada's fleet. The aircraft began its flight in Montreal and was due to fly on to Edmonton, a flight time of 4 hours. On board were Michelle and Shona Dorius.
We usually fly another airline, not Air Canada. And on my way to pick up the tickets, that other airline was fairly busy. So I decided to go to Air Canada to purchase my tickets there.
2 hours after takeoff, cruising at 41,000 feet, things were about to go seriously wrong. First, a low-pressure warning light for the left engine fuel pump came on.
One of the low-pressure fuel warning lights illuminated with the oral warning, and our emergency handbook simply showed to shut the pump off. There are 2 pumps for each tank. That's not a problem.
But within seconds, the second fuel pump also seemed to malfunction.
When the second low-pressure fuel warning light came on, this was too much of a coincidence. In a brand new airplane, 2 pumps would fail on the same flight.
Captain Pearson shut down the left engine and diverted to Winnipeg. But then, the unthinkable happened.
We had just shut down all the services to the engine when the right engine failed. And the reason we knew the right engine failed was that all of our beautiful gauges had disappeared off the video display terminal.
With both engines shut down, all electrical power was lost.
It was a movie, and the movie just was starting, and then all of a sudden, it stopped. At that time, I just thought, well, it's a technical difficulty, so I guess there's no movie, that's the end of that.
I just remember saying something to Michelle about, I don't hear the motors, I don't hear the engine, and it sort of gave me a weird feeling.
On the flight deck, the crew were in command of an aircraft that had no engines and only a few navigation instruments.
As pilots, we trained in simulators ad nauseum on operating with engine failure, but we had never trained with loss of all engines, nor was there a procedure for us to follow. We were just improvising as we went along. Probably fewer instruments than a pilot would have had at the end of the First World War.
The captain never told us that we had no power or the engines weren't working. I think that was smart of him not to tell us that, because there's not much I can do. Like, I can't go and start these engines for him. He might as well not scare me more than I am.
There was no electrical backup, but Captain Pearson was able to drop down a small propeller from the aircraft's belly. Turned by the airstream alone, it generated just enough hydraulic power to control the 3 primary flight controls. He was now piloting the world's biggest and heaviest glider.
Well, every aircraft is a glider. If the engines are shut down, they're not a good glider because of the drag of the engines, but every aircraft will glide.
With a rate of descent that was too fast, the crew realized that they could not reach Winnipeg. Their nearest runway was a private airstrip in a place called Gimli.
The prudent thing seemed to be to head for Gimli, even though it didn't have emergency equipment. The primary goal was to get the airplane safely onto a runway. And at Gimli, there are 2 6,800-foot runways.
Captain Pearson was now 6 miles from the runway. With no engines, he would have only one chance at landing. His speed was crucial. Too slow, and the aircraft would drop like a stone. Too fast, and he would overshoot the runway. He decided to risk a maneuver he had only tried before in a light aircraft, a side slip.
The only way I could control our speed to slow down and to control our rate of descent, to maintain a steady glide path, was to fly the aircraft inefficiently through the air. And that entailed cross-controlling the rudder and the ailerons. This caused the aircraft to fly in a crab-like situation, which I varied.
Landing a light aircraft while side-slipping is difficult enough, but to attempt it in a wide-bodied jet with no engines requires incredible nerve. For the passengers, the angle of the plane was terrifying.
The back of the aircraft, it was probably the worst part of the flight, was the last 6 miles in the side slip with this very unusual attitude, with the wings tilted very steeply, one towards the ground, one towards the sky. It probably was quite frightening for the passengers.
When the plane went sideways, I could see down, right down, and we were really close to the ground, and I saw 4 golfers on a green with their mouth wide open looking up in the air, and that was so funny. I said, my God, we're in trouble. Because the look on these people and standing, looking up in the air was something to see. But then I said, oh, we're in trouble at that point.
I was totally sure that we were going to crash and die.
At the last second, only 40 feet above the ground, Captain Pearson had to straighten up his aircraft.
Now as we come over the threshold of the runway, we straighten the aircraft out. Keep it going down, normal flare, and touchdown.
Bob Pearson had achieved the impossible. He had brought a jet airliner down from 41,000 feet with no power and landed safely. But the nose wheel had collapsed halfway down the runway, sending up sparks.
The attendants were really adamant that we had to get out of the aircraft right now. leave right now, and they also had told us not to stay close to the aircraft. And they said, get out right now and go away from the aircraft.
Everyone was evacuated in case of fire, but there was none. The aircraft had run out of fuel. A faulty fuel gauge on board the plane was compounded by an error in converting from imperial units to metric units when the plane was refueled. The aircraft had taken off with only half the fuel needed. Loss of all engines in daylight is bad enough, but one pilot has experienced even worse. In June 1982, a British Airways 747 jet with 247 people on board flying at night and over the ocean was heading straight for disaster. British Airways captain Eric Moody was flying his 747 from Kuala Lumpur to Perth when suddenly his engines began to fail.
Well, when the first engine failed, yes, you don't like it, but it's nothing to worry about. So my reaction was, oh, let's shut it down. The flight engineer then said something like, gosh, number 2's gone, number 3's gone, and something like, oh, golly gosh, we've lost the lot. So we had no engines going. At that stage, you don't believe it's happening, and you take a second look and you take a third look.
The passengers knew from the sound that all power was lost.
We heard the most frightening sounds, as though the engines were running on gravel. It was a grating, crunchy sort of sound. And then they became quite intermittent, and eventually, one after another, they just stopped. After that, it was just an eerie silence.
Captain Moody put his aircraft into a dive to try and reignite the engines at a lower altitude, where there is more oxygen to burn.
And we're up at 37,000 feet, but we don't really expect them to happen because of the density of the air and that sort of thing until you get to 29,000 feet. But we were taught to try. So the first few attempts, we didn't expect anything to happen. But when we got to 29,000 feet, we did, and of course, nothing happened.
Captain Moody was unaware that the aircraft was flying through volcanic ash from an eruption on the island of Java. The ash had clogged up the engines and caused them to fail. As the crew pumped fuel into the engines to reignite them, the passengers were horrified to see huge flames.
We noticed bright red flames come out of the engine and were floating past the aircraft. Incorporated with that were sort of fireballs as well, coming out in, well, one after the other.
Well, it looked like blowtorches coming out the back of these engines, and I do believe that some of them thought the engines were on fire.
It was about that time that we got this quite startling announcement from the captain.
I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem and all 4 engines have failed. We're doing our utmost to get them going, and I hope you're not in too much distress.
The captain maintained his airspeed by diving steeply and then pulling up sharply.
The aircraft seemed to have a ducking action, rather like a roller coaster. It went slowly uphill. This was the sensation we felt. Slowly uphill, paused at the top, ready for that death-defying dive on the other side. And that's how it felt. And I had a real fear that the aircraft would break up in the air.
Desperately, the crew kept trying to restart the engines.
I would think probably 40, 50, 60 times in, but I have no idea how many times we tried, but we would have gone on trying till we could try no more.
With no land for miles, the captain decided he had no choice but to ditch the aircraft, a difficult and dangerous maneuver.
It was dark, I couldn't see anything, and I knew judging the height above the sea at night is not easy when everything's going for you. What I didn't know at the time My lights were sandblasted, so I've had no lights to help me. So I think probably it was impossible.
After gliding for an agonizing 14 minutes and dropping 25,000 feet, the engines suddenly burst into life. The aircraft had flown out of the volcanic ash cloud, allowing enough air back into the engines. But landing the 747 was not going to be easy. The captain's windshield had been sandblasted by the ash, making it impossible to see. Several vital electrical systems had also been destroyed.
Stand up and look.
I had to stand up and look round the side of the front windscreen, and I flew the aeroplane standing up. The flight engineer who sat between the two pilots manipulated the throttles, and I called out the power settings I wanted to maintain the speed that the co-pilot was calling out, and he was also calling out the height that we were and the distance from the runway. So it was a real team effort to get us on the ground.
The aircraft landed safely, with no casualties.
There was a stunned silence for a few seconds, and then the whole aircraft burst into a round of applause, cheering, hugging each other, a little bit of weeping, and it was just a wonderful feeling to be back on terra firma.
As soon as we touched down, all the negative thoughts that I had regarding wings falling off, oxygen failing, diving into the sea, all disappeared, and I felt a great sense of relief and a great thankfulness to the crew and to God, knowing that I had life ahead of me.
The aircraft's engines were practically ruined, and it cost millions of dollars to repair the 747. Captain Moody was later awarded a commendation by the Queen for his actions.
I had no reaction whatsoever. I had no life flashing before me on the way down. I had no nightmares afterwards. And in fact, the only thing that happened was my hair, and within 6 months of the incident, a little white patch formed up here. And within another 6 months to a year, I'd gone fair all over. So I have to put that down to being frightened.
At the world's busiest airports, aircraft can take off or land every 60 seconds. In just one day, that's up to 2,000 planes. Air traffic controllers are responsible for keeping all these aircraft apart.
Traffic south is Boeing 757 for the south.
Every day, they shepherd thousands of flights safely through their airspace.
110 heavy, traffic south is Boeing 7863, south contact center.
Connor 139, thank you. Follow him to the airport.
Air traffic controlling is like a complex three-dimensional puzzle.
26 traffic is still 6 miles east of you, leaving your altitude no factor.
Pilots must rely on the air traffic controllers to guide them through this maze.
Etika 146, maintain 250 knots.
The chances of a mid-air collision are incredibly slim, but tragically, they do happen.
757 for the south complex, heavy Boeing 767.
In 1977, a Boeing 727 approaching San Diego Airport collided with a light aircraft over the suburbs. Both planes crashed to the ground and disintegrated. All 135 on board the 727 and the 2 occupants of the light aircraft died. 7 people on the ground also lost their lives. The worst ever mid-air collision happened near Indira Gandhi Airport, Delhi. A Saudi Arabian Airlines 747 with 312 on board collided head-on at 14,000 feet with an Air Kazakhstan cargo plane with 37 crew and passengers. There were no survivors. But a mid-air collision is survivable. William Query, a pilot for Atlantic Southeast Airlines, was flying his commuter plane to Atlanta with 4 passengers. He had taken off from an airport with no air traffic control tower and was being extra vigilant.
Well, we're accelerating up past through about 200 knots. I saw a spot that for a minute I thought was a bug on my windshield, and I hadn't seen it before, and I was staring at it, and it suddenly developed a spinner, which is a portion of the nose cone of an airplane. And shortly after that, it sprouted wings, and I realized it was an airplane that we were head-to-head on.
Captain Query's plane was heading straight toward a Cessna light aircraft.
First, you've got to identify the fact that it is an airplane, and it takes just maybe a few microseconds to decide which way to go to try to avoid it. So the closure rate with two craft coming head-on was probably over 300 knots. The estimate was we had something like 6 seconds to miss it, and probably took 2 to 3 seconds to come to a reaction. And then, of course, the aircraft's got to respond to the control inputs. So we were pretty much at the ragged edge of having enough time to avoid.
The captain took evasive action, but it was too late.
I watched the aircraft go over top of us, and I thought we had missed it. Then we had an impact, very loud impact. And the aircraft pitched nose down.
The impact destroyed most of the tail of Captain Query's aircraft. His plane nosedived out of control.
At the time, I had no conception that we could successfully get the plane on the ground. I felt the plane was going to crash, and what I wanted to do was pick a spot that wouldn't damage any people. And there was a river handy, and I was going to head for the river.
As the aircraft plummeted over 3,000 feet, Query decided the only way to stop their fall was to use brute force.
I had a quite large first officer, and I asked him to get on the controls and help me. He put his feet up on the instrument panel and started pulling real hard. And with the two of us pulling, we were able to reduce our rate of descent to an acceptable rate. Well, realize when the adrenaline's pumping through you, you can you do a lot that you don't realize you can do.
With both Query and his first officer wrestling with the controls, communication was vital.
A slight problem develops in that one doesn't know when one's pulling and the other's pushing, so we had to coordinate that verbally. I'm coming back, I'm pulling back, down a little bit, up a little bit, that sort of thing.
Captain Query landed safely at his destination. The Cessna pilot and passenger hit the ground and died. Even though he was given one of the highest awards civil pilots can receive, the accident still haunts him.
I was upset because midair should never happen, and it was, I felt it was my fault. Should have seen them.
Some emergencies are more bizarre and unpredictable than others. No pilot would ever believe that they could end up hanging outside their aircraft at high altitude. But this is exactly what happened in 1990 when a British Airways captain was sucked out of the cockpit when his windscreen blew out. Flying at 17,000 feet, Captain Tim Lancaster suddenly saw his window begin to move. It then blew out, the decompression tearing him from his seat. His head, arms, and torso were sucked out, and he was battered against the fuselage at close to 350 miles per hour. The outside temperature was minus 54 degrees.
My last recollections on the aeroplane, I was actually sitting looking through the windscreen when it disappeared, and I saw it go, and I remember a very large bang, which was obviously explosions, the air all went out. And then, I suppose it must have been shortly after that, I remember it being very windy, once again when the upper half of my body was out of the window, and my next recollections really are waking up in hospital.
The purser, Nigel Ogden, managed to grab the captain's legs before he was completely sucked out of the plane. For nearly 30 minutes, Ogden held on to the captain as the first officer made an emergency landing. Captain Lancaster suffered fractures to his arms, frostbite, and shock. The windscreen that blew out had been replaced the previous night, but the maintenance crew had mistakenly used the wrong bolts. The average passenger might believe that if they were involved in an air disaster, there would be no chance of survival. It may seem that there is little point in listening to the safety demonstration. But in fact, there are survivors in a high percentage of aircraft accidents. This is all that was left of a United Airlines DC-10 after it crash-landed in Sioux City, Iowa in July 1989. The aircraft should never have made it to a runway. But thanks to the extraordinary skills of an off-duty pilot called Denny Fitch, nearly 200 people walked away from this wreckage. On July 19, 1989, Captain Denny Fitch was returning home to Chicago as a passenger on United Flight 232.
The trip home was an off-duty situation. I was not to be performing anything. I was basically looking for lunch and a nice glass of Merlot and a ride home for to see my family.
Another of the 296 on board was Jerry Schemmel, a sportscaster for the Denver Nuggets.
I was traveling with my boss, Jay Ramsdell was his name, and Jay and I had known each other for several years, but he just hired me about 3 months before this. The flight was supposed to take off at 7 a.m. When we got there about 6:30, we found out our flight was canceled. Of all things, mechanical problems with the plane we were going to fly on that day. We get put on standby for 4 different flights, and finally the 4th standby flight's when we got on, which turned out to be United Flight 232. I don't think I've ever been more relieved to get on a plane in my whole life. I've been waiting there for almost 7 hours to board a plane. By the time I sat down in my seat on that plane, I think I was as relieved as I've ever been with a flight.
An hour after takeoff, United 232 was in trouble.
We were cruising along at 37,000 feet, and there was a loud, muffled explosion that came from the rear of the aircraft. It had quite a physical impact on the aircraft. The aircraft yawed severely to the right. The nose shifted to the right quite abruptly. And that was followed by 10 seconds of very violent airframe shuddering. And I would liken that to driving your automobile at very high speed down a cobblestone road.
It was a massive explosion. First thing I thought was a bomb has gone off. I think the explosion itself set the panic off, but then when the plane started to drop and we went into a fall, then complete chaos set in.
The tail-mounted engine had suffered a massive mechanical failure. A fan disc installed with a tiny undetectable defect finally cracked after nearly 20 years in service. Instantly, the pilot shut down the engine and continued to fly the plane.
It's the most trained maneuver we do, so after that analysis came, relieved that that's what it was. I knew the pilots were very well trained. I train them, and I know how good their training is, and so I felt very comfortable that they can continue and land safely on the remaining 2 engines.
But Denny Fitch was unaware that this flight was in even greater trouble. He tried to reassure a flight attendant.
I simply told her that don't worry about this. This thing flies fine on 2 engines. We simply need to get to a lower altitude where the air is more dense. We're going to be fine. And she looked at me and said, "Oh no, Denny, we have just come from the cockpit. Both the pilots are trying to fly the aircraft, and the captain has told us that we have lost all our hydraulics."
When the engine exploded, pieces of metal pierced the tail and severed the main hydraulic lines. The pilots were left with no way of flying the plane.
Captain Haynes got on the PA system and said that the number 2 engine explosion caused a lot of damage to the rear of the aircraft. And he said, these are exact words, he said, "I'm having a lot of trouble controlling the plane." When a captain tells you he's having a lot of trouble controlling the plane, things must be pretty serious, or he wouldn't say that. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, if he's telling us that, we've got to be in trouble. I better start listening to flight attendants. I better start getting ready for a crash landing.
Denny Fitch was asked to step up to the flight deck to help the crew. What he saw was beyond belief.
I look forward to find both pilots with their control yokes in a complete full left turn. To do this in a normal airplane, you are going to make a very sharp turn to the left. And instead, this airplane continued to fall off to the right. In other words, totally unresponsive to the control inputs. And that's when I realized that, in fact, the worst had happened. The unthinkable had indeed occurred.
United 232 had lost all flight controls. The crew radioed United's maintenance base for help, but no one could believe that all hydraulic control had been lost.
And it took a laborious step-by-step process before finally they had to accept it. And I was once told that among those people, they were looking at each other and said, "We're talking to 4 dead men."
In the main cabin, the passengers sat waiting, not knowing what their fate would be.
The feelings of helplessness were overwhelming, I think, for myself and for several others. I thought about the fact that I might not make it, and I thought a lot about that, in fact. I began to think about the things I had done to that point. The last 3 words I told my wife that day were, "I love you." I just bought a new life insurance policy, so that the practical matter of my wife having money if I were to pass away entered my mind. And I add those things up, and I thought, maybe it's my time to go. Maybe I'm being told something here. And then I thought about the fact that I might not make it when we hit the ground.
On the flight deck, the crew did have one crude way of controlling the aircraft.
The captain gave me, by the way, I'm a total stranger in this cockpit. They don't know me. I'm in civilian clothes. And the captain gave me the only thing that was controlling his aircraft, in effect, was his throttles.
By increasing the thrust to one engine and decreasing it to the other, Denny Fitch managed to steer the aircraft. For over 40 minutes, he guided the plane in this fashion to the nearest airport at Sioux City, Iowa.
By the last 15 or 20 minutes, I think we were ready to go. It was like, let's just get this thing over with. We've gone through emergency landing procedures. We're ready mentally, physically. Let's get this thing over with. And it just kept dragging on and on and on.
Emergency services were scrambled for a crash landing. With 10 minutes to go before they reached the airfield, Captain Haynes prepared the passengers.
Captain Haynes told us, I'm not going to kid anybody, this is going to be rough. He said, this is going to be rougher than anything you've ever been through. Please be ready. The thought to me at that point was, this cockpit captain is making sure we understand this is going to be a crash. We're not going to land this plane safely. We're not going to walk off this thing when we come to a halt. And I knew and feared the worst at that point.
With no flaps to slow down for landing, United 232 was coming in much too fast.
If we could get it on the runway, that was perfect because that gave us a hard surface. And somehow, some way, if I could just keep this thing steered with reverse thrust on the ground, we may run off the end of the runway. We may go into that cornfield at the far end. Corn would slow us down, we'd stop, 8 doors would open, 296 souls would slide down, and we all go to the nearest bar and I would buy. I really believed with my whole heart that we were going to pull this off. I really did.
Just before landing, Denny Fitch pushed the engines to full throttle to lift the nose.
I just put all the power I could get out of the engines, put the throttles full forward, hoping that power would bring the nose up and arrest that sink rate, and we'd land like a duck would on water. And the timing was just not quite good enough.
Flight 232 hit the runway at over 200 miles per hour.
We hit so hard, I recall my hands flew off the throttles by the impact, and I was facing forward in the seat, and it's like a giant hand was behind my head and slammed my face down into the radio rack. And there was a tearing of metal, tremendous noise, and there was an engine screaming outside.
I wasn't quite ready for just how hard we hit. It felt like we just dropped out of the sky and hit the ground. And I looked around, glanced from side to side at that point, and I saw people being thrown about in the cabin in the first couple of seconds after we hit down. And I thought to myself, we have hit down incredibly hard, and there's probably already some people who are dead in this plane. And then all this debris, just unrecognizable stuff being thrown everywhere inside the plane.
I could feel my body going up and over. And in fact, the airplane was rolling up on its nose. And we pogo-sticked with the nose of the aircraft, the cockpit, if you will, embedding into the field. And I can remember the windshield going brown and green. I can remember in real time the air conditioning still blowing on my shoulder. And then the window cleared for a split second. It darkened a second time. And then there was heat and humidity and just more violence than I can possibly bring to words. The next thing I remember is that I was upside down and I was impacted and trapped in the wreckage with great pain and and heart difficulty in breathing. And my eyes and ears were filled with mud and I couldn't hear or see anything.
The plane had cartwheeled along the runway, broken up, and come to rest in a cornfield.
It was very strange. Number one, to get out of a totally dark, smoke-filled plane into this bright sunshine, it was almost blinding, and realize that I was in a cornfield. I think the full scope of what had really happened hit me at that point, because I realized what I was looking at, where I had come from, was only part of that plane. The rest of it was somewhere else.
When you look at the wreckage of our cockpit, it's indistinguishable mass of metal. Nobody would have dreamed anybody was in there.
The flight crew, all four still alive, were trapped inside their cockpit for 30 minutes.
When I was taken from the wreckage, I will never forget this as long as I live. I felt a hand tap me on the shoulder, and it was Sergeant Brian Bowerly of the Sioux City Air National Guard. And I'll never forget his words. He says, "You're okay, buddy. I got you. I've got you." And even now, it's an emotional.
The crew's exceptional skill in landing this unflyable plane saved the lives of 184, but sadly, 102 others did perish. For those who did walk away, feelings of guilt began to surface. Jerry Schemmel, who lost his friend, also remembers a young child sitting near him.
He's 2.5 feet away from me, and one moment he's alive, and the next moment he's dead. And I had a rough time with that, which I never expected. I always felt like I could look in the mirror and see the luckiest guy in the world. I survived this thing when everybody around me didn't. And that's the way I wanted to feel, but it just wouldn't let me. The guilt of surviving hit me really hard.
I think that what I did that day, I'm very much at peace with. I've flown that approach 1,000 times in my mind. I've beaten myself up. I've given it every opportunity to find some chink that I could have made better. In the previous 25 years, there's 1,200 fatalities and loss of control in flight. It's never had a successful outcome. Somehow we did it. In some miracle, we did it.
What they did was just a little bit short of a miracle in my mind. It doesn't really add up physically that they were able to keep that plane in the air. Everybody connected with Flight 232, I think, from the survivors to the families of the people who didn't make it, say thank you to that cockpit crew.
Air accidents can happen for many different reasons. But when there is a real emergency, the only people we can rely on to bring us safely back to Earth are the pilots. At the world's busiest airports, aircraft take off and land every 60 seconds. Every day, hundreds of thousands of flights depart and arrive safely. But some don't.
Suddenly I had this absolute realization that I was going to die.
I looked for my wife, and she had been sitting on my right, and she was gone.
I just got engaged to be married, and just when I felt I couldn't breathe anymore, that I had to get out, I wanted to get married, and I had to keep going.
Just waited, basically. Just waited to die.
Not everyone has a fear of flying, but we all have a fear of crashing. The airplane, the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century. In less than the 100 years since the Wright brothers' first flight, this incredible machine has completely changed the world. But sometimes, the miracle of flight comes at a heavy price. Is this your worst nightmare? Trapped in an aircraft, heading for a crash landing. Just exactly what is it like to be there when things go wrong? In 1989, a United Airlines 747 with 355 on board came close to catastrophe when a massive explosion ripped a 15-foot hole in the side of the aircraft.
Well, my wife and I were basically going to New Zealand and Australia on a business trip vacation. We took off for Auckland, February 24th, 1989.
As they climbed through 23,000 feet, the passengers settled back for the long flight from Honolulu to New Zealand. Jim McGee was half asleep when he heard a strange noise.
I heard the buzz of the motor, and sat up because that wasn't a normal sound. And then heard a thump, and my eyes went to the baggage bins, and suddenly they just disappeared, just gone.
The noise Jim McGee had heard was the cargo door beginning to open. Instantly, there was a massive decompression. The force ripped away a 15-foot piece of the fuselage.
Well, after it blew out, everything went white for an instant. Then I'm suddenly looking at the sky, or really not sure what I'm looking at, but realized that nobody was there and the side was gone, and thought it was a bomb. I don't know how to describe it. You just suddenly realize that you're in deep doo-doo. I mean, this is a serious problem.
The force of the decompression was so great that 8 people and their seats were sucked out to their deaths.
It's like a disappearing act. It's just, there they are and there they're gone. Basically, the floor was cut right next to the aisle, next to where we were sitting.
The captain put the plane into an emergency dive to a lower altitude where the air was breathable. The oxygen masks had been sucked out in the decompression.
Looked for oxygen masks, but they were basically gone. So just waited, basically, just waited to die. Then I turned and said goodbye to my wife, which she didn't want to hear because I'm the optimist in the family. And she said, at that time, said to herself, gee, if he's saying that to me, this doesn't look very good.
When the fuselage was ripped away, large chunks of debris destroyed the two right-wing engines.
You become tremendously calm. I mean, when you realize that you have no control and you're going to die, and everybody says this, a real calmness comes over you. Your life doesn't flash in front of your face. In fact, at one point, I thought about my children and had good insurance and kind of smiled to myself that they're all going to be sassy and rich. Felt good about that.
The aircrew managed to keep the jumbo under control and turned back to Honolulu.
I screamed at my wife that this guy was flying this thing, and hang on, you know, we've got a chance. Not really believing that, but at least we weren't tumbling and falling. And then we broke through the clouds right over the city of Honolulu, looking out this 30-foot hole. It's a beautiful sight to see Honolulu. And that's when I really had a good feeling that we had a shot at something.
With just seconds to go, Jim McGee and his wife prepared for an emergency landing.
I was expecting a crash landing. Told her that if we hit and it starts to break up, to just basically get in a roll, and maybe you'll roll out the hole and end up on the runway.
Incredibly, the undercarriage had not been damaged, allowing the crew to make a perfect landing.
When we stopped, it was like this huge weight off your shoulders. And I just wanted to sit there and laugh. I mean, it was so funny. You know, I said, God, we made it, you know, just made it. And the last thing on my mind was evacuating this plane. I just wanted to sit here and enjoy it for a few minutes.
For Jim McGee, the simple act of wearing a seatbelt may well have saved his life.
There was a gentleman in 9F. He was angry, didn't get to sit where he wanted to. He was bumped down from first class because the plane was full, and was asked to buckle his seatbelt because the seatbelt sign was on, and he basically told the flight attendant he wasn't going to buckle his goddamn seatbelt, and probably less than a minute later, he was gone.
9 people died that night. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that a faulty switch or electrical wiring in the cargo door control system led to the door opening. Over 10 years later, Jim McGee is still haunted by the experience.
I'm a nervous flyer. I always will be. In the case of my wife, she doesn't fly. She just doesn't think she needs to be scared again. It's a burden for me, but you numb it somehow.
For everyone, the thought of such a horrific accident is terrifying. But for some, the fear is so intense, they cannot even board a plane.
I gave up a flight to Hawaii, a nice planned vacation. I just started stressing about it about 3 months ahead of time and said, I'm not gonna be able to do this.
I got to the airport, got to the ticket counter, and as soon as I was in line, I began crying and just completely lost control over everything, and my body was shaking. I was hyperventilating.
Feelings of panic, feelings of being trapped, those feelings washed over me in a way that prevented me from flying from that day forward.
But some fearful flyers cannot avoid flying. For them, every trip is a nightmare. Larry Lucchesi is on his way to the airport. Since he booked his flight a week ago, his anxiety levels have been rising.
I sometimes dream about it, and the night before I can't sleep. Keep waking up, or not. I don't sleep at all, I just lay there. The day of the flight, almost a surreal morning. I look at every little thing as a sign that something's going to go wrong. It's that feeling of doom. So if a flight's delayed, the immediate thought that goes through my mind is, well, maybe that's a sign that something bad was going to happen.
How safe is traveling by plane? We are often told, statistically, that flying is the safest form of transportation. Driving a car is considered far more dangerous. But Mary Schiavo, an attorney and former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, has a different view.
The statistics on the safest form of transportation are, like a lot of statistics, obviously custom-made for those who need them. If you want to skew the statistics and make them come out in your favor, then what you do is you measure it on a per-mile basis. On a per-mile basis, the plane wins. But the statistics are really this. When you look at the number of trips, the airplane and the automobile are about the same.
In fact, in the UK, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents has calculated that, per journey, there are 10 times more air fatalities than car fatalities. If each plane ride is even more dangerous than each car ride, perhaps a fear of flying is not so irrational.
I think it would be an irrational fear had there never been a plane crash, or had there never been turbulence. That would be irrational if I feared something that never happened before, but I'm fearing things that have happened.
The public should be afraid of flying on certain carriers and under certain conditions. But the scariest thing is you can't really tell what those flyers and conditions are. In this country, only recently, it's been possible to get some data on the safety performance of carriers, more realistic data on problems with particular kinds of airplanes. But when it comes right down to it, many accidents happen in bad weather. So you have a combination of factors: bad airlines, bad maintenance, bad government oversight, and bad weather. If all four of those are present, don't go.
Larry Lucchesi's flight today is a short hop of less than an hour.
I do try to use statistical data and logic to talk myself through all fear. But when you're in the situation, it's a little bit more difficult than just saying planes don't fall out of the air. I mean, when you're in turbulence and you're buckled up, no matter what you say, statistically, the sensation that you're feeling overrides the logic part, because your mind could just take you on a whirlwind. And the panic sets in, and then there's no way out of it.
On today's flight, Larry will be delivered to his destination by over 100 people, most of them invisible to him. He must now trust them with his life.
You sit down in this tube of 300 people all facing one direction, and you're looking to the side and you never see what's in front of you. It's not like sitting in a car where you have that 360 degrees, and as a passenger you can say, slow down, there's a car coming. You don't have that. It's a lack of control.
Larry has reached one of the most dangerous parts of his flight. There are more accidents on takeoff and landing than at any other time. Takeoff is one of the most testing times for both flight crew and machine. Engines are at full power as 300 tons is carried skywards. In October 2000, a Singapore Airlines 747 started its takeoff roll at Taipei Airport in Taiwan. Visibility was poor. A tropical storm was lashing the airport with torrential rain that night. The pilot had mistakenly taken off from a runway that was closed for maintenance.
The runway he should have taken takeoff on is 5 left, which is this one. The runway he took off from is 5 right.
As the huge jet powered down the runway, it smashed into a crane just before taking off. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed. 83 people died. At busy airports, there can be over 2,000 takeoffs and landings every day. It's vital that the runways are kept absolutely clear. At every airport, there are teams of spotters who are on constant lookout for dangerous debris. Mike Corlett is one of a team at Los Angeles International Airport.
Proceeding on runway 24 left, City House 44.
Twice a day, the air traffic control tower give Mike Corlett the go-ahead to dash down the runway and check the surface.
If during a runway check we do find something, it depends on the nature of the object. If it's something small, we can stop, advise the control tower that we found something, pick it up, and continue on. If it's something major, a little bit bigger than that, we'll go ahead and close the runway, get it taken care of, and then open it up again.
Mike Corlett now has just 90 seconds to complete his runway check.
When you actually look in your mirror and see a 747 behind you, you really have a lot of faith in the air traffic controllers that they're going to give you a window of opportunity to get out there and do your check. It'll really get your heart going, that's for sure.
It's a logistical impossibility to check a runway after every single takeoff. Yet, just one tiny piece of debris could set off a disastrous chain of events.
Liken it to Swiss cheese. You buy a pack of Swiss cheese, hold it up to the light. Ordinarily, all the holes don't line up. But every once in a while, you buy some Swiss cheese, and it does. And that's like safety on aviations. Most accidents are when several things go wrong, and usually there's a fail-safe. Unfortunately, sometimes all of the tragedies do line up.
For 30 years, the world's most glamorous aircraft, the Concorde, has been the envy of the world. It's the most advanced civil aircraft ever built, but the supersonic jet is not infallible. On the afternoon of July 26, 2000, at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris, an Air France Concorde packed with 109 on board took off, bound for New York. But within 2 minutes, the aircraft had crashed. All 109 passengers and crew, plus 4 people on the ground, died. The pilot had tried to reach a nearby airfield, but he had virtually no control of the aircraft. It smashed into a hotel annex, leveling it. The building was practically empty, but one Englishwoman jumped from a room seconds before the impact.
I heard what sounded like a plane taking off, and it just got gradually louder and louder and louder until it really was deafening. At which point the whole floor started to tremble, and I realised something was up. So I went straight for the door of the hotel room that I was in, saw all the flames, saw there was no way out via the stairs or anything, and obviously just went straight for the window.
The supersonic airliner could have been crippled before it had even taken off. Ongoing investigations suggest that as the jet sped down the runway at close to 200 miles per hour, one of its tires struck a small piece of metal that had fallen from another aircraft minutes earlier. The Concorde's tire exploded, and debris was sent hurtling up to the fuel tanks. The tanks ruptured, and the leaking fuel started a massive fire. All Concords were grounded, while engineers designed new fuel tank linings. When an aircraft roars down the runway, it reaches a point where there is not enough runway left to stop. The fearful flyer is now committed. When a plane reaches its cruising altitude, most passengers are able to relax and enjoy the flight. The fearful flyer has to face the next challenge: turbulence.
It was a very, very hot day in Spain, so the turbulence was bad. It was bad enough, though, that a lot of people on the plane were actually screaming, and that was very disturbing.
Being in that plane with that moment of panic, with everyone screaming and everything flying through the air and not knowing what was going to happen and being pretty certain I wasn't going to make it, that really shook me up.
We had a lot more turbulence coming in than I expected, and I ended up having to brace my feet and close my eyes. Not that the turbulence was that bad, but by force of will, I was going to keep that plane up.
In rare cases, turbulence can be deadly. This amateur footage, shot on a 747 flying to Honolulu, shows the moments after the aircraft plunged 1,000 feet. One passenger died and 110 were injured. Aircraft manufacturers design their planes to withstand all natural events. Even the worst type of turbulence cannot break up a jet airliner. Manufacturers deliberately test aircraft to near destruction before a single passenger is allowed to fly. The aircraft may withstand anything nature can throw at them, but they all require thorough maintenance.
Maintenance varies dramatically in the U.S. Right now it's in complete flux because in the bad economic years, airlines just farmed out everything to basically the lowest bidder. And when you farm out the maintenance goes the control. But worse than that is the government has admitted they have a very difficult time inspecting farmed out maintenance because the inspectors can't be every place. Some inspectors have literally hundreds of facilities to inspect.
In 1988, a Boeing 737 operated by Aloha Airlines was diverted to Maui when the entire upper half of the fuselage between the cockpit and the wings was ripped off.
Just like there was no bomb explosion or anything, just poof, like a balloon would explode and the top came off.
A crack within the airframe had not been noticed. One flight attendant died, having been sucked out of the aircraft, but miraculously, the crew landed the plane safely. Wearing seatbelts does save lives. Luckily for the passengers, they were all wearing them when the fuselage disintegrated.
I think in maintenance, one person can make a mistake or not do something and it would be detrimental. And I believe that could be the case in any maintenance kind of situation when you're maintaining a machine. But when you're at 35,000 feet, suddenly it becomes a major concern.
Some tragic accidents remain an unsolved mystery. In January 2000, an Alaska Airlines MD-80 en route to San Francisco crashed into the Pacific Ocean.
The crew checked in advising that they had a jammed stabilizer and were experiencing difficulty maintaining altitude. Tumbling, spinning, nose down, continuous roll, corkscrewing, and inverted.
I thought it was a remote control plane because it looked so light and unmaneuvered, it just was out of control.
The flight was so erratic, it looked like a model plane. Part of the tailplane had malfunctioned. The authorities are still trying to find out why. The last words of the Alaska Airlines captain were, "Blue side up," as he desperately tried to right his upside-down aircraft. All 83 on board died. Sitting still for long periods of time can lead to a condition called deep vein thrombosis, where blood clots form in the legs. When a passenger disembarks and starts walking, the clot could start circulating around the body and reach the brain or the lungs. To make matters worse, the air we breathe inside the cabin can also be unhealthy.
Unfortunately, within the cabin of the airplane, you're in an environment filled with germs and dirt, and it's, one of the dirtiest, germiest places that there is. The seats, the tray tables, the blankets, the pillows, everything was blanketed with germs and bacteria, viruses, E. coli, pink eye, you name it. But it's the air itself as well. There are no specific strong standards for what the quality should be. It's hit or miss. Federal prisons actually have standards for air quality. The airlines are worse, and there have been many documented cases in this country of people getting tuberculosis and other airborne diseases on planes.
But sometimes the main danger can be other passengers. Passengers that endanger the lives of everyone else on board. A British Airways 747 was brought close to disaster in December 2000 when a deranged passenger broke into the cockpit and seized the controls from the captain. Fortunately, the passenger was restrained and the plane landed safely. This flight attendant was held hostage on live TV by a man holding a knife, making political demands. He was overpowered by ground security. A far greater threat to aircraft surfaced in the 1960s, when hijacking leapt onto the front pages of the world's media. In 1 week alone, in 1970, 5 aircraft were hijacked and flown to the Middle East. In front of a global TV audience, the aircraft, empty of passengers, were blown up by hijackers. To counter this new threat, the government established the Federal Air Marshals Program.
The Federal Air Marshals provide specially trained armed teams of civil aviation security specialists who are capable of rapid deployment worldwide. The program is based on use of minimal force. However, that force can be lethal if it's determined necessary in order to protect the passengers and crew.
In this shoot house, the Air Marshals train with live ammunition. This is one of the few facilities in the world that uses live bullets in a closed environment.
I can't get into the specific number of missions, but I can say that Federal Air Marshals are flying on U.S. air carriers internationally and domestically every day. It would not be unusual for a passenger to have a Federal Air Marshal sitting next to him.
As part of their training, they also act out hijack scenarios on board an aircraft.
All right, go into the cockpit. We got it. Open this door! Open this door! It's a hijacking!
Although they do not use real bullets here, their marksmanship is closely monitored.
The firearms standards for Federal Air Marshals are among the highest of the U.S. government. And usually when we end up losing somebody in the program, it's usually for failure to meet the firearm standards.
Ready, up!
Since the Air Marshal program started over 30 years ago, there have been only 2 hijacks of U.S. carriers.
I wish we could say that hijacking's gone out of fashion, but I think if you take a look at recent situations around the world, unfortunately, hijackings still occur. It's our belief that the United States Federal Air Marshal has provided deterrence, that people who, terrorists, criminals who may want to hijack an aircraft have to take in consideration the possibility of a Federal Air Marshal being on board an aircraft.
Modern screening devices at airports have also helped to reduce the risk of hijack. The latest generation of scanners can now detect plastic explosives, such as Semtex. But not every country can afford such high-tech protection for its travelers. In 1996, the hijacking of an Ethiopian Airlines 767 became the worst in history when it crashed into the sea off the Comoros Islands in the Indian Ocean. 127 people died. The pilot, Captain Leol Abate, was no stranger to hijacks. This was the 3rd time an aircraft under his command had been threatened.
I told them I would do anything they like. I was ready to cooperate with them, and I told them I will do anything they like.
On board was the U.S. Consul General for Bombay, Pancho Huddle, and his wife.
One guy came sort of running up, waving his arms wildly as if he was a bit crazy, frankly. And I'm not sure what he was trying to say. I thought he was a bit of a nutcase. And then I saw a guy sort of flitting up quietly and slowly up the way, and I said, uh-oh, this looks like some sort of coordinated effort. Must be a hijacking.
The hijackers announced that they had a bomb and were taking over the plane.
The bomb, I think, was sort of what looked like a shoebox with a few wires sticking out of it. Who knows what it was? That's my recollection. Although hazy on this. Surprising how poor you can remember things when you think you're going to die.
They said, fly us to Australia. I said, okay, I'll fly to Australia, but we have to discuss some points. They said, no discussion.
As the plane headed south, Captain Abate tried to explain that they did not have enough fuel to reach Australia. The hijackers wouldn't listen and ordered him to keep flying.
It was not my favorite 4 hours afternoon, Saturday. You were nervous, you were edgy, you tried to read the newspaper 5 or 6 times, you couldn't get anywhere. There was an eerie calm that as we flew further and further south, people wondering what's going on. My net feeling for the whole thing was very much that I thought there was going to be some sort of very bad outcome of it.
After 4 hours, the aircraft was dangerously low on fuel. The captain tried to negotiate with the hijackers one last time.
And I told them if they could make any changes. And I showed them, there is an island here. It's way out of Africa. So this is your last chance to refuel. They said, no, we don't need any fueling. We'll go as far as the aircraft flies, then we crash. I said, if you don't want to reach your aim, and if you want to die in the air, why do we have to kill all those innocent people?
What did they say?
They said, never mind, we're making history.
Captain Abate was left with no choice. He announced to the passengers that the aircraft had now run out of fuel and he was going to have to ditch in the ocean. As the 767 lost height, Pancho Huddle and the rest of the passengers prepared for the worst.
There was real panic, people crying, people, praying in the aisles and stuff. And I started to try to do the obligatory, oh dear, I love you, it's been a good ride, whatever, sort of stuff. And my wife, who's a tough customer, sort of waved that off and sort of, don't give me any of this nonsense.
Just before hitting the sea, Pancho Huddle gave one of the hijackers a menacing look.
I took off my glasses and kind of gave him a real hard look with him, right eye to right eye. And my intent was, I was giving him I hope you're near me in the water, because I was a swimmer on the Junior Olympics, and I'm going to put you down.
The plane ditched. The force of the impact killed most of the passengers.
The plane sort of hit the water, and it was very gentle, and I sort of breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, wow. Wow, this is going to be better than I thought. About 10 seconds later, it was like a 15-mile-an-hour accident and a 30-mile-an-hour accident. Then it was like a 60-mile-an-hour accident, and my last thought was, uh-oh, I'm dead. Very quietly, uh-oh, I'm dead. The next thing I knew, I woke up and I said, I'm alive, literally talking to myself. I'm alive. That was probably the most bizarre feelings I've ever had in my life. That 1 second after I sort of woke up in the water, or the next few seconds, you survived a major plane crash. You're incredibly lucky.
Captain Abate had managed to guide the aircraft to within 200 feet of a beach resort.
I think I went through the front windshield. And anyway, I just went out of the cockpit. It was a miracle.
I was floating in the water, bobbing, just like a chipmunk in a lawn chair like this. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. I'm out there alone in the sea. There's some trash, coffee mate on the water. I'm bleeding badly in my hand and my foot. Almost instantly, I looked for my wife, and she had been sitting on my right, and she was gone. My heart sank. And then I looked quickly to my left, and she was there, also bobbing in the water, also with her seat. It's the same thing as mine, exactly. And she had never blacked out. I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm okay."
Thanks to Captain Abate's piloting skills, lives were saved. But of the 176 on board, 127 people lost their lives.
Everybody wants to focus on the survivors. It makes you feel good. But the reality is that most of the people died and they never had a chance.
All three hijackers were among the dead.
The hijackers were never on my mind after the plane hit the water. Frankly, I figured that the one that I knew was near us, that I had bad vibe, was not going to make it because he was standing up without a seatbelt on. They got what they deserved. I can't think of a better way to say it. They killed 127 people.
Captain Abate later received one of the highest awards that can be given to civil pilots for bravery and exceptional piloting skills. Larry Lucchese's flight is just 15 minutes away from touchdown. Any feelings of relief are short-lived, as he knows he has re-entered the most dangerous time in a flight. As with takeoff, the aircraft is working to its maximum as it descends, and the aircraft is entering congested airspace.
When you have a lot of planes that coming into a relatively small area, that's, to me, juggling and playing with the potential of air collision. Also, how about down on the ground? The planes that are taxiing out to the runway, are they out of the way? There's not a lot of time there.
Airframe 062 heavy cross, runway 24 left, contact ground 121.65 is cross.
Air traffic controllers are highly trained, motivated people. They manage to guide thousands of planes in and out of crowded airports with rare mistakes. But with the ever-increasing amount of traffic, and in some cases, airports working with old technology, accidents will happen.
Alitalia 622 Heavy, loss of terror.
The most alarming statistic in aviation safety is the increasing number of runway incursions, where more than one plane occupies the same runway at the same time.
Runway incursions is the biggest threat on the U.S. horizon. Our airports are terribly overcrowded, handling more planes than they were ever built to handle. And unfortunately, the one thing that was supposed to save us isn't ready, and that's our new air traffic control system, which will be based on GPS, computerized traffic. It's not ready. It won't be done until at least 2008, probably 2015.
On a February night in 1991 at Los Angeles International Airport, an air traffic controller taxied a small commuter plane with 12 on board onto a runway. Forgetting that she'd done this, the controller then cleared a US Air 737 to land on the same runway.
Just moments after we landed, there was this huge crunching impact that was terrifying. And a few moments after that, roaring flames appeared, shooting by my window on the left side.
The jet airliner had crashed into the commuter plane, lost control, and smashed into the side of a building. Thick, acrid smoke began to fill the aircraft. Staying under the poisonous fumes, David Koch made for the nearest exit.
I decided to crawl down the aisle on my hands and knees towards the rear of the plane. And several people walked over me, stumbled over me.
Outside, flames were now engulfing the entire aircraft. Koch was convinced he wouldn't make it.
Suddenly I had this absolute realization that I was going to die, that I was trapped, there was no way out, and that I was a dead man.
Trapped in the economy section of the burning 737 was an English television researcher with 4 colleagues.
We all started getting out of our seats and making our way towards the emergency exits. But it was slow progress because the aisles were so packed with people, there was nowhere to go, really.
Tessa Chevalier realized the only way she was going to get out was to jump over the seats.
I knew I had to hold my breath or I was going to choke. And I knew that I didn't really have very long then. If I didn't push forward and find that exit, I would die.
Finally, she reached the overwing exit.
I had a thought in my mind that I had actually jumped over all the seats to get past people. I didn't want to jump out of the airplane in front of people if there were people trying to get out. I was very surprised and a bit horrified when I got to the exit and found that there was nobody getting off. They were obviously all overcome. They were lying there in the aisles. So it wasn't surprising that the queue wasn't moving forward at all. So when I realised nobody was trying to get off, I just felt my way out of the exit and jumped into the smoke.
David Koch was still trapped. With one last effort, he staggered to the front of the plane.
I saw a crack, a very thin crack of light. I pulled really hard, and all of a sudden, the crack moved open, and I suddenly realized it was the galley door that I had pulled open. I found myself looking out at the ground below me, flames shooting up from the underbelly of the airplane, and this incredible wave of pleasure and adrenaline came over me when I suddenly realized that I wasn't necessarily going to die, that I had a chance to live.
In his stockinged feet, he jumped.
I stood there and watched this phenomenal sight with absolute amazement. The entire airplane, from the nose to the tail, was in flames. It's big, shooting high, wicked flames.
Tessa Chevalier waited for her last 2 friends, Adrian and Dave, to emerge from the burning aircraft.
We were all sitting on the bus afterwards, watching to see who was coming out of that door. We saw Adrian sort of staggering out, falling out of the aeroplane. And we waited and we waited, and Adrian was the last one out. And Dave didn't get out.
"34 people lost their lives that night. The 12 passengers and crew in the commuter plane died instantly when the 737 crashed into it. 22 of the 86 on board the U.S. Airjet died. Most were found just a few feet away from the exits, overcome by the toxic smoke.
I did feel guilty that I had got out and my close colleague, of whom I was very fond, had not got out. And I did think, what could I have done? If only I'd kept hold of his hand, if only I'd said, come on, this way, then he might be with us still. But there was no guarantee that I would have got off going the way I went. I could have contributed to his destruction just as much as if he'd stayed where he was.
With hindsight, the vast majority of air crashes have proven to be preventable. Maybe one day, there will be no accidents at all.
If we can get there, there are wonderful things that literally would make many planes idiot-proof and also provide great margins of safety for operations, aircraft separation, landing, navigation, should make getting lost and getting disoriented a thing of the past. And they're all on the drawing boards and being developed now with the help of computers. We just have to hope we can afford them.
Even if 100% safety were achieved, some people would always be terrified of flying.
I'd love to think that one day I could get into a plane and see it as a form of transportation where I could relax and read and enjoy the film or the meal, or see it as a part of the trip as opposed to the hell that I see it as. But I don't know that I don't know that I'll ever get to that point.
And for the few people who have survived a plane crash, what are the long-term effects of such an experience?
You basically accepted dying, and you didn't. I think I'm a lot different. I think we're both a lot different towards our children. I don't think we sweat the small stuff as much as we used to.
I know for the first month or two I had that kind of like feeling you get after you finally graduated from college, or you made the football team, or finally got the girl to say yes, or whatever the things are that animate you. But, and then gradually it got back to just, another day at the office. I don't worry about balancing my checkbook as much as I used to. That's probably true.
I think it's given me perhaps a different set of priorities in life, because I've had a moment where I thought my life might end. I've always wanted to make the most of life at the time, not worry too much about the future.
My emotions gradually evolved into one of gratitude. I felt the big guy upstairs, the good Lord, was looking after me. Why would he allow me to escape that plane when so many other people around me died? But you really do feel sort of spiritual after you come through something like that. It's really quite a dramatic thing.
No matter what safety precautions are put in place, accidents can still happen. But however we interpret the statistics, the chances of dying in a plane crash are many millions to one.
Christmas morning 2009, and thousands of people boarded planes all over the world in a last-minute dash to make it home. But one man's journey had a very different motive. A 23-year-old suicide bomber, trained by Al-Qaeda, planned to destroy a busy passenger jet bound for the US.
Terrorists come back to aviation over and over again because it is such a dramatic target.
The plot was painstakingly devised to circumvent our aviation security systems.
These are guys who are extraordinarily inventive in the ways they attack the system.
Technologies developed over decades to defend us from terrorist attack.
I don't know of one case where any form of technology caught a terrorist with a bomb.
The terrorists have so many options. We can't protect against everything.
The plot would also expose fatal flaws in Western intelligence systems.
The American intelligence system had enough to know that Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib should not be allowed to get on the plane.
This is the story of how Al-Qaeda smuggled a bomb on board Flight 253.
And all of a sudden I heard a pop.
And then the flight attendant, she just tore down the aisle at full speed.
And discovers what the surprising outcome would have been had the Christmas Day bomb plot gone to plan. Christmas Eve 2009. In Accra Airport, Ghana, a young man called Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib began a 23-hour voyage from Africa to the US. The first leg of his journey was Virgin Nigeria Flight 804 to Lagos.
Abdul-Muttalib begins what is going to be a long journey to the United States in Accra, Ghana. He's going to fly just a few hundred miles along the coast of Western Africa to Nigeria on what is essentially a short hop of a flight.
He was an ordinary-looking guy, very student-looking, very relaxed, very chilled, very clever, very intelligent, knew his way about the aviation system, didn't necessarily generate any concern to anybody.
Abdul-Muttalib's appearance may have been just of a kid traveling alone on his way to the United States, perhaps to visit friends or family. He was part of a quite sophisticated plot.
In a very real sense, Abdul-Muttalib didn't fit the stereotype of what I guess many of us assume a terrorist is.
The Western-educated son of a wealthy Nigerian banker was used to international travel, but today's journey would be different. Abdul-Muttalib was on a mission to get through airport security in 3 different countries and board a plane with a bomb in his underwear.
Unknown to everyone else, sewn into his underpants is a military-grade explosive that is known to be a threat to aviation.
Abdul-Muttalib's 7,000-mile journey will take him via Lagos to Schiphol in the Netherlands. There he plans to board a flight to Detroit. As the plane prepares to land in America, he will explode his device. Abdul-Muttalib's bomb plot would be just the latest in a long line of terrorist attacks on passenger airliners. Attacks that seem to have evaded every new attempt to tighten security.
There's a constant battle going on between terrorist organizations on the one side and the aviation industry on the other side.
As things have evolved over time, the terrorists are looking at how we do things, and they're finding vulnerabilities. And the game is continually changing, and the problem is they have multiple ways of achieving their goal.
The Christmas Day attack would once again push the boundaries in the cat-and-mouse game between terrorists and the constantly evolving security systems they seek to evade.
Al-Qaeda has the unique advantage of being an enemy on the offensive, being very crafty and innovative, but also being able to understand almost instantaneously via the internet and the press what its enemy, the United States, the UK, and others, are doing to stop it.
Abdul Muttalib's plot was devised to exploit one of the last remaining loopholes in aviation security. Just after 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib touched down in Nigeria, completing the first leg of his journey. He had smuggled his bomb through one airport security check and onto a plane undetected. He was now 22 hours away from his goal, detonating his bomb inside a US plane packed with passengers. At Lagos Airport, one of Africa's biggest, Abdul Muttalib faced a well-established series of aviation security checks before he could board his flight to Schiphol. Like all international airports, Lagos follows a strict airport security protocol known as ICAO Annex 17. It sets down basic security procedures developed over decades to prevent terrorist attack. The bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie in 1988 forced perhaps the biggest rethink of aviation security since the 70s.
Sabotage is the most likely cause of the Scottish air disaster. All 258 people on board a Pan American jumbo jet died when the plane exploded and crashed to the ground.
Recreations of the blast revealed that it was caused by 400 grams of Semtex. The explosive was hidden inside a radio checked into the hold by a passenger who didn't board the plane. The attack led to rules requiring hold baggage to be screened to deter terrorists.
When you check your suitcase to fly, that bag is sent through explosives detection systems, computed tomography. It's like a CAT scan at the hospital. The chance of that technology finding what it's looking for, basically automatically, is nearly 100%.
Lockerbie also meant that planes couldn't take off until all passengers who had checked baggage into the hold had boarded. As a result, terrorists were forced to change their tactics. They had to become suicide bombers, carrying their bombs on board planes hidden in hand luggage or on their bodies. They would still encounter security technology, but of a type introduced to counter a threat from an earlier era.
We had a spate of hijackings, often involving knives, handguns, incendiary devices, grenades being taken on board planes, planes being hijacked and oftentimes taken out into the desert and held for ransom.
Due to the hijackings, the Take Me to Cuba era of the late 60s and early 70s, the decision was made to screen all passengers boarding aircraft. The technology then is not too dissimilar to the technology now to screening checkpoint.
We have metal detection to identify whether we're carrying any weapons on the person. We have X-ray machines to put your bag through to make sure there's no explosive device. We have trace detection systems. People's bags are swabbed to see if there are any trace elements of explosive.
When a passenger enters a metal detector arch, it sends pulses through the body, creating a magnetic field that reflects back a signal. If the pulse meets anything metal, like a knife, or the wires and components of a bomb, an opposing magnetic field is created, which triggers an alarm. But metal detectors cannot detect explosives hidden on the body. X-ray scanning machines allow operators to see inside carry-on bags to look for the outlines of weapons and possible explosive devices. At Lagos Airport, CCTV captured this image of Abdul Muttalib calmly reading a newspaper as he waited to go through security screening. He was told to put his shoes through the X-ray scanner. The measure was introduced 8 years earlier after shoe bomber Richard Reed smuggled explosives onto a plane hidden in his trainers. But Abdul Muttalib had his explosives hidden elsewhere. He passed through the metal detector without his bomb setting off the alarm.
The single biggest concern that aviation security officials have is explosives that are non-metallic, that are carried in private parts of a passenger's body.
They have determined that we don't have anything in place to find explosives hidden on the person.
His carry-on bag also passed through the X-ray machine without incident.
Al-Qaeda know the capability of the technology that's deployed in airports worldwide. An X-ray device will look for an improvised explosive device or the telltale signs of that device.
Since the package of explosive was hidden in Abdul Muttalib's groin, a standard physical pat-down would almost certainly not have been intrusive enough to discover it. His device had been meticulously designed to evade airport security. In fact, it was a kit of component parts he wouldn't even assemble until he's on board Flight 253. The main charge was the high-explosive pentaerythritol tetranitrate, or PETN, a compound widely used in demolition.
PETN is readily available. It can be used in powder form in small amounts to have great effect. It's been used by terrorists over the years, so it's not a new compound or a new concoction.
The terrorists knew that if Abdul Muttalib handled the bomb, he could be caught by electronic trace detectors that sniff out explosive residue. So it's likely someone else created the device. The package, once tightly packed, would be no bigger than a mobile phone, and its plastic wrapping would deter detection.
If you take the explosives and you case them in something that's not porous, in other words, it doesn't let out vapor or particles, and then you take that item, that sealed package, and you cleanse it, then nobody can find it with any technology.
Instead of a conventional detonator that could be detected by metal detector or X-ray machines, he had a small amount of liquid chemical to ignite the PETN. Finally, he had a syringe to administer the chemical that he could claim he carried for medical reasons.
This was the perfect device, simply made out of components that couldn't be seen by the conventional technology that we have in airports nowadays. They've developed a device here that can essentially sail through all of that security process entirely undetected.
The idea of smuggling Abdul Muttalib's explosive through security checks in his underwear had already been road-tested by Al-Qaeda. 4 months before the Christmas Day attack, a suicide bomber had blown himself up in a failed attempt to assassinate a Saudi government minister. It was discovered that he, too, had passed through a metal detector with PETN hidden in his underpants.
The attempted assassination of Mohammed bin Nayef, the counterterrorism chief for Saudi Arabia, was an incredibly important moment. This was a canary in the coal mine because it suggested that Al-Qaeda in Yemen was growing more sophisticated with its explosives, that they have a bomb maker that's expert in this. And it also suggested that this was a new way that they were trying to hide the explosive.
Western intelligence issued no official warning to alert aviation security officials to Al-Qaeda's new deadly tactic. Standard airport security technology had so far failed to stop Abdul Muttalib. But he still faced a second system of safeguards, security documentation designed to ensure only genuine passengers can board planes. At 8:35 p.m., Abdul Muttalib presented his passport. It held a US visa granted 18 months earlier when he'd been at college in London. He cannot board a US flight without it. If he had subsequently come under suspicion, the US authorities might have revoked it, stopping his mission in its tracks. Abdul Muttalib's visa was still valid, and he was allowed to continue his journey. There was nothing in Abdul Muttalib's prestigious Nigerian background to suggest he might be a suicide bomber in the making. The young man's journey towards jihad appears to have begun 4 years earlier while he was studying engineering in London.
He was the head of an Islamic society at his university. At the same time as Abdul Muttalib was getting more and more deeper into his studies of Islam, he also was expressing on internet sites how lonely he was and how isolated he felt. It's the kind of recipe for someone who could get caught up in the kind of extremist views.
Abdul Muttalib seems to have been the perfect operative. Here was a clean skin, somebody who wasn't known to the intelligence community.
They're looking for people who may not look like the typical operatives that Al-Qaeda has relied on in the past, and who can operate pretty easily in Western societies.
In 2008, he left London to continue his studies in Dubai. Then he abandoned the course and travelled across the Middle East. His destination was Yemen. One of the poorest countries in the region, it's been plagued by civil war and weak government. By 2009, it had become a crucible for Al-Qaeda terrorism.
Yemen has always been a haven for Al-Qaeda. It's the ancestral home for Osama bin Laden. You've really had a witch's brew of problems in Yemen that has allowed Al-Qaeda to take deeper root.
Matthew Salmon came to Yemen to learn Arabic. He didn't realize that one of his fellow students was an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber in the making.
My first impression of him was that he was a very gentle individual. He was very soft-spoken, but very friendly as well. He never talked about his past. He inferred that when he had lived in Western societies, he was uncomfortable.
One day in September 2009, Abdul Muttalib simply disappeared.
I had noticed that he had left. He had left without saying goodbye to any of the students. And we all found it strange that he had left without saying goodbye to us or telling us where he was going.
While in Yemen, it's believed that Abdul Muttalib came into contact with notorious extremist cleric Anwar al-Awlaki.
The reach of Anwar al-Awlaki is vast, and he is like the siren song for many Westerners seeking a radicalized path within Islam.
One of al-Awlaki's disciples was U.S. Army psychiatrist Major Malik Hassan, who shot dead 13 people at Fort Hood military base in Texas. Hassan had exchanged 18 emails with al-Awlaki, who also had links to the 9/11 bombers. Al-Awlaki has denied any role in Abdul Muttalib's Christmas Day attack. Abdul Muttalib had dropped off the radar, but nobody suspected that he had joined the ranks of Al-Qaeda. Except for one man, his father.
In November 2009, Abdul Muttalib's father entered the U.S. Embassy in Abuja. He was concerned about his son, that his son was growing more and more radical, and that he was falling in with the wrong crowd and had traveled to Yemen.
His dad is the chairman of a very big bank in Nigeria, and so this is not like just some nobody coming in from the street. He's someone that the officials there respect and take a warning quite seriously.
The embassy sent a warning, called a Visa Viper, to the National Counterterrorism Center in McLean, Virginia. Analysts there established Abdul Muttalib had a visa allowing him to travel to the US. But it was decided that his father's concerns were not enough to revoke it.
That kind of report comes in, dozens of times a day, maybe even hundreds of times a day from different places across the world. It was a single thread. It was alone, in isolation. It was enough to essentially do almost nothing other than to put it into the system.
Experts believe the intelligence should have prompted further investigation.
The father was a prominent individual in Nigeria, and he used some important words like radicalization, Yemen, things that should have triggered further scrutiny, but it wasn't highlighted. There wasn't diligence done.
Nobody took ownership of that single fact and started asking those pertinent questions of the other agencies within US government.
Abdul Muttalib arrives in Schiphol just around dawn. It's 5:37 a.m. Now it's Christmas Day.
After a journey of 11 hours, Abdul Muttalib is now within sight of his final objective: to get on board Flight 253 to Detroit and take down the plane and everybody on board. But Amsterdam's Schiphol airport is where Abdul Muttalib's murderous plan is most likely to fall apart. It is one of the world's biggest and busiest hubs, handling on average 1,100 flights a day.
Abdul Muttalib, as he makes his journey from Africa and Ghana to Nigeria to Amsterdam on his way to the United States, is passing into bigger and bigger airports. And in fact, he's passing into more sophisticated security systems. In Amsterdam in particular, the security system is considered very strong.
They take it very seriously. They spend the money to do it right. They've been pioneers in a number of areas of security. They come as close to doing it as right as anybody I know.
And it's not just enhanced security he faces. Because Abdul Muttalib is flying to Detroit, his journey would face live online interaction with the US authorities for the first time. Post 9/11, all flights to the US have been treated as prime terrorist targets.
I wouldn't say I was completely relaxed. I was just maybe a little bit nervous. I'm often a bit nervous on an American airliner flying to America. I was really surprised. I thought in flying on Christmas Day, I thought it would be rather quiet, but it was very crowded.
Passengers for Northwest Flight 253 start queuing for security, unaware that one of their fellow passengers is a committed terrorist.
I was traveling from Mumbai and I'm visiting India with my family. I was very excited. After 5 weeks, everybody likes to come home, and it was Christmas Day. I was very excited to meet my family members.
Abdul Muttalib is required by international accord to go through security yet again.
The US demands that all passengers flying to the States face extra questioning by security personnel employed by the Dutch authorities. It's a professional, one-on-one grilling designed to blow a terrorist's cover story.
He's already traveled for 11 hours. He's probably tired. He's also probably increasingly nervous. You know, he's basically a novice at this.
This is the last line of defense. This is the place where you absolutely have to stop the guy who has intent.
If there's going to be a time that he's going to stumble, this is probably the moment.
While they're asking the questions, they are looking for reactions from the person.
He's facing questions about, where is he going and what is he doing?
Might be a question as to why he was carrying no coat with him when he's going to a cold destination, why he's got so limited baggage on him. It's not going down that checklist and just ticking boxes, but actually digging a little bit deeper if there's even the slightest suspicion that somebody may not be as clean as would appear.
Al-Qaeda intensively train their operatives in preparation for this, the toughest moment of their mission.
They looked at his passport, they asked him questions, they looked at his visas, they looked him in the eye, which they're trained to do, and he was able to convince those people that he was not a threat.
Abdul Muttalib passed his biggest test. But, according to a fellow passenger, after more than an hour spent on the ground at Schiphol, he was struggling to maintain his composure.
I was looking around. There's a strange guy standing. His right hand was on his forehead. and he was like looking nervous. So I was thinking something is strange or weird looking, this guy. I wanted to say to somebody, but then I said, this is not my job, this is a security job, so I let it go.
As the passengers check in for Northwest Airlines Flight 253, information that Abdul Muttalib was about to board an American plane was winging its way around the globe to US officials. After check-in and up to 30 minutes before the plane departs, airlines flying to the States must submit details of all passengers to the National Targeting Center. One of the NTC's jobs is to check passenger names against watch lists of individuals who might pose a direct threat to the US. A month earlier, his father had warned the CIA that his son might be mixing with Islamic extremists. Although it wasn't considered enough to revoke Abdul Muttalib's US visa, his name was added to a counter-terrorism database of people thought to pose a low-level threat.
Abdul Muttalib's name, because of what his father had reported, appeared on the broad terrorist identities data mart environment, the TIDE database. That's almost 600,000 individuals at this point. That's the grand radar screen of suspect individuals.
It's a hodgepodge of people. It could be something as simple as you once before had crossed the border into the United States from Mexico and were carrying some food that was prohibited, and therefore you were put into TIDE.
The National Targeting Center don't routinely check the TIDE list before boarding. For them to stop Abdul Muttalib getting on Flight 253, he would have to be on the toughest list of all, the no-fly list.
The no-fly list, the most selective of these lists that are public, is a list of about 4,000 individuals. We have enough information about these individuals to suggest that they are a direct danger to the aircraft.
The no-fly list is just what it says on the tin. It's a list of individuals who are not allowed to fly for whatever the reason that might be, and primarily that reason is their connection with terrorism.
Abdul Muttalib was on a list for the U.S. government, but it wasn't the no-fly list, which would have disallowed his boarding of the flight to the United States.
The no-fly list doesn't just protect those traveling to and from the US. It is shared with most international airports. The National Targeting Center cleared all 279 passengers to board Flight 253. But there had been a serious breakdown in the US intelligence system. Crucial information elsewhere in the system that would have put Abdul Muttalib on the no-fly list had been fatally overlooked.
Some non-U.S. intelligence service intercepts a communication among suspected al-Qaeda members in Yemen that says there's a, quote, Umar Farouk, no last name, an Umar Farouk who is in Yemen and perhaps participating in some plot. Separately, there's information that there's a Nigerian in Yemen that's in some way participating in a plot. It's around the same time as the dad has come to the embassy and said, my son, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, has disappeared. He may be in Yemen, and he's gotten caught up with extremist views.
There were bits and pieces all throughout the U.S. intelligence community. We didn't put the pieces together well enough and quickly enough to stop Abdul Muttalib, this kid, from getting on the plane.
The failure of the system to join the dots about Abdul Muttalib has implications for all international airline passengers.
It's a system that is not serving us well either in the United States or, for that matter, elsewhere in the world, because we are talking about a global threat here, and we are talking about an intelligence community that should be keeping an eye on that global threat as effectively as possible.
By 7 a.m. on Christmas Day, there was just one last obstacle standing between Abdul Muttalib and Flight 253 to Detroit. The final pre-gate security check. and one single piece of technology that could prove his downfall. Schiphol, along with many Western airports, had started introducing millimeter-wave body scanners to their security armory. Millimeter waves are radio waves set to a frequency that allows them to pass through clothing. When they encounter a solid surface like the human body, they bounce back, and the reflected waves create a naked image that reveals any object concealed beneath clothing, even non-metallic ones. The technology offers the best chance of detecting a suspicious package concealed on someone's body.
They allow the guys manning the security checkpoint to see whether you have anything hidden underneath your clothes, anything strapped to your body that could pose a risk to everybody else that's getting on the flight.
By Christmas Day 2009, Schiphol Airport had a number of body scanners on site. But they had been unable to reach final agreement with US authorities on how they should be used. It meant that Abdul Muttalib faced only the standard metal detector and X-ray technology. He cleared both without any incident. Abdul Muttalib had overcome the twin safeguards protecting Flight 253's passengers from terrorist attack. Conventional airport technology had failed to detect the bomb in Abdul Muttalib's underwear. And the world's most sophisticated intelligence system had proven unable to identify Abdul Muttalib as a deadly threat. The 23-year-old suicide bomber was poised to launch a Christmas Day attack that would shock the world. At 8:55 a.m., Northwest Airlines Flight 253 took off from Amsterdam bound for Detroit. There were 290 passengers and crew on board. Among them, the Keepman family, flying home from Ethiopia with two small children they had adopted.
I think we all felt different from when we traveled there versus traveling home because we had two new beautiful children that were experiencing flying for the first time. They were experiencing everything new for the first time, and it made it that much more important to protect them and make sure that they were safe.
Also on board in seat 17G was 20-year-old musician Daniel Husinger.
Having been gone for 2 months, I was looking forward to seeing my family and my friends, just being able to see them face to face, give them a hug, say Merry Christmas.
2 rows behind Daniel, another young man was traveling alone. Seated in 19A was 23-year-old Nigerian Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, an Al-Qaeda-trained suicide bomber. He had reached the final phase of his mission to bring down Flight 253 and everyone on board.